The psychic scream that tore through the segmentum solar was not sound, but pure kinetic pressure. It began in the Imperial dungeon beneath the Himalayan mountains and radiated outward at the speed of thought. The Golden Throne had suffered a catastrophic harmonics failure. The ancient machinery that kept the webway gate closed behind the Emperor finally slipped its cog teeth after 10,000 years of decay. The psychic feedback loop snapped. In the chorister halls, 10,000 licensed psychers burned to ash in a single second. Their souls were consumed not by the Emperor, but by the sudden vacuum of the failing machine. The Astronomicon flickered and died. Across the galaxy, 1 million void ships were instantly blinded in the warp. They were torn apart by demons or lost forever in the tides of the Imperium. This was the end of the Imperium of man. This was the final death of terror. The master of mankind sat upon the throne. His physical body was a husk of dry bone and wire, but his mind was a roaring star of focused will. He felt the gate opening. He felt the laughter of the chaos gods pressing against the breach. He calculated the outcome with cold, inhuman speed. If he remained anchored to the rotting machinery, the backlash would detonate the talisman of 7 hammers implanted in the throne. Terror would burn. The soul system would cease to exist. Humanity would fall. He rejected this outcome. There was only one tactical option remaining. He had to sever the connection. He had to remove the immense weight of his psychic soul from the equation to let the backup containment protocols slam the gate shut. He had to leave his universe. He gathered the sum total of his power. It was a force that had held back 4 gods for 10 millennia. It was a gravity well of spiritual might. He compressed it. He sheared his consciousness away from the rotting corpse on the throne. The physical backlash shattered the Imperial Palace. The custodes standing guard were thrown against the walls by a shockwave of golden light. For a microsecond, the Emperor existed nowhere. He was a packet of pure order tumbling through the chaotic foam between realities. He bypassed the warp. He bypassed the realm of souls. He punched a hole through the fundamental walls of existence. He sought a vacuum. He sought a place where the laws of physics would accept a being of his magnitude. The transit lasted an eternity and an instant. He fell through layers of existence that possessed no name in High Gothic. Then he hit solid ground. The impact did not create a crater of dirt. It created a crater of gravity. The air screamed as it was displaced by a sudden immense mass. The Emperor of mankind stood up. He was no longer a skeleton on a chair. In this new reality, the laws of biology yielded to the laws of the spirit. His will shaped his form. He appeared as he had in the Great Crusade. He stood 14 feet tall. His armor was auramite gold, shining with a light that hurt the eyes. A laurel wreath rested on his brow. In his hand the burning sword appeared, summoned from the memory of his previous existence. He looked around. He was standing in the middle of a paved street. It was night. The architecture was primitive, resembling the 2nd millennium of terror, but cleaner. Strange vehicles moved on rubber wheels. The air tasted of ozone and unrefined promethium. But it was the psychic atmosphere that drew his attention. The warp did not exist here. The screaming thirst of the chaos gods was gone. It was silent. Yet there was power. He felt distinct, sharp points of spiritual energy nearby. They were not psychers drawing from the warp. They were individuals projecting their fighting spirit into physical avatars. The ground beneath his sabatons cracked. The sheer density of his presence was too much for this world. Buildings shook. Glass shattered in windows for 3 city blocks. He did not move to attack. He simply existed. The local reality bent around him, trying to accommodate a being who was effectively a living god of order. He scanned the horizon with eyes that could see the soul of a planet. He sensed a nearby presence of immense strength. It was not human. It felt like a predator. It felt like a vampire. In a nearby mansion, a man named Dio Brando stopped his reading. He stood up. His skin prickled. He felt a pressure that made his own stand. The world manifest involuntarily to protect him. It was not an attack. It was the feeling of a larger predator entering the territory. Dio walked to the window. He saw the golden light rising from the city center. It turned the night sky into noon. The Emperor of Mankind took his first step in this new world. He did not know where he was. He did not care. His mission remained unchanged. He would bring order. He would unite humanity. He would destroy any threat to his species. He raised his burning sword. The fire illuminated the terrified faces of the local populace. The conquest had begun. The Master of Mankind stood amidst the ruins of the Cairo intersection. The asphalt had not merely cracked. It had undergone a molecular phase shift due to the sheer proximity of his psychic core. The road surface was now a vitrified glass composite. It radiated heat. The surrounding buildings groaned as their foundations struggled to support the sudden localized increase in gravitational density. The Emperor did not move. He was running a diagnostics check on his own existence. His body was whole. The golden armor of the custodian pattern, specifically his personal auramite plate, was intact. The burning sword in his hand hummed with a frequency that caused the teeth of nearby civilians to ache. He expanded his sensory net. He needed to understand the strategic layout of this new theater. He reached out with his mind. He covered the city of Cairo in a heartbeat. He felt millions of souls. They were dim lights, flickering with weak biological energy. They were unrefined. They were ignorant. But they were human. The panic began in concentric circles. The drivers of the vehicles nearest to him had not fled. They were catatonic. The sight of the Emperor was not something the human brain was evolved to process. It was called transhuman dread when applied to the Astartes. With the Emperor, it was something far worse. It was a biological command to submit. Men and women wept openly in their cars. Their minds flooded with a sudden, overwhelming sense of unworthiness. Those further away screamed. They abandoned their vehicles. The traffic gridlock instantly solidified into a wall of steel and glass. The noise was deafening. Horns blared. Sirens began to wail in the distance. The Emperor ignored the noise. It was irrelevant data. He focused on the threats. He sensed the distinct signatures of the powered individuals of the race again. They were closing in. He took a step forward. The glass road crunched. A taxi was in his path. He did not walk around it. He walked through it. His knee struck the bumper. The force field surrounding his armor acted as a molecular wedge. The car split in half down the chassis. The metal shrieked as it was torn apart like wet paper. The two halves slid away, sparking against the ground. The driver sat in the exposed seat, staring up at the golden giant. The Emperor did not look down. The individual was not a threat. The Emperor continued his march toward the city center. He required a defensible position to establish a command locus. The local governance was clearly inefficient. The disorder on the streets was unacceptable. The Egyptian police were the first to respond. 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the edge of the cratered intersection. Officers spilled out. They drew their sidearms. They shouted commands in Arabic. The Emperor understood the language instantly. His mind stripped the linguistic patterns from their surface thoughts and assimilated the syntax. They were demanding he halt. They were demanding he drop the weapon. It was a logical response for local enforcers. It was also futile. The Emperor continued walking. One officer, overcome by terror and adrenaline, fired his weapon. The bullet was a standard lead projectile. It flew toward the Emperor's chest. 3 meters from the armor, the bullet hit the telekinetic wall. It did not stop. It vaporized. The kinetic energy was converted instantly into a flash of harmless light. The Emperor did not break stride. More shots followed. The air filled with the cracks of gunfire. The result was a light show of sparks dissolving against the golden aura. The Emperor stopped. He turned his head slowly to face the officers. The movement was mechanical and smooth. He looked at them. He did not use his voice. He used a directed telepathic pulse. It was a low-grade command, stripped of nuance. Cease. The word echoed inside the skulls of the officers. It was not a sound. It was a rewriting of their motor functions. Their hands opened. Their guns fell to the ground. Their knees buckled. They collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air as the pressure on their nervous systems released. The Emperor turned back to his path. They were neutralized. High above the city, a falcon flew in circles. It was not a natural bird. It was a user of the force known locally as a stand. Its name was Pet Shop. It served the vampire Dio. The bird possessed keen intellect and supernatural vision. It watched the golden giant. It saw the police fall. It felt the heat rising from the street. The bird felt a primal instinct to flee, an urge that overrode its loyalty to Dio. This was a predator that ate reality, but the bird had orders. It folded its wings and entered a dive. It summoned its power. Ice formed on its wings. Sharp, jagged icicles materialized in the air, aimed at the giant's exposed head. The projectiles launched with the speed of bullets. The Emperor sensed the thermal drop before the ice formed. He analyzed the energy signature. It was not warpcraft. It was a projection of psychic will manifesting as elemental manipulation. It was disciplined but crude. The icicles struck the golden halo. They shattered. The Emperor stopped again. He looked up. He saw the bird. He analyzed the creature's biology from a distance of 200 meters. He saw the anomaly in its brain, the psychic connection. He extended his hand. He did not fire a bolt of lightning. He reached out with a telekinetic grip. He seized the bird in midair. Pet Shop squawked as the air around it solidified. The bird could not move its wings. It was frozen in a cage of force. The Emperor pulled his hand down. The bird was dragged out of the sky. It crashed onto the pavement in front of the Emperor. The creature struggled, summoning more ice. A glacier began to form on the street. The Emperor frowned. This uncontrolled use of psychic phenomena was dangerous. It could lead to instability. He stepped on the ice. The heat of his boot melted it instantly. He looked at the bird. He dissected its mind. He saw the master. He saw the mansion. He saw the vampire. This was valuable intelligence. The bird was a servant. The Emperor applied pressure. The bird's physical form ruptured. It was a quick execution. The threat was removed. The Emperor stood over the remains. He had confirmed the existence of hostile psychic entities. He had confirmed that they were organized. This required a shift in doctrine. He could not simply walk to the center. He needed to purge the immediate area and establish a beachhead. He looked at the buildings around him. They were apartment blocks, shops, offices. They were disorderly. He planted the tip of his sword into the melted road. He closed his eyes. He accessed the molecular structure of the city block. He pushed his will into the stone, the steel, the concrete. Alchemy was a science he had mastered millennia ago. The ground began to rumble. It was a deep tectonic grinding. The civilians who were still conscious scrambled away. The buildings did not collapse. They flowed. The concrete softened like clay. The steel girders groaned and bent, not breaking, but reshaping. The emperor was rewriting the architecture of the district. Walls merged, windows disappeared. The chaotic skyline of the intersection smoothed out. The grey concrete turned white. It hardened into marble. In the span of 3 minutes, the emperor converted 4 city blocks of Cairo into a flat, defensible plaza. In the center, he raised a dais of granite. He ascended the steps. This was his temporary throne. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, a jeep sped through the sand. Joseph Joestar clutched the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. Beside him, Jotaro Kujo stared at the horizon. The sky above Cairo was glowing with a steady, unnatural gold light. It was night, but it looked like dawn. In the back seat, Avdol held his head. The fortune teller was sweating profusely. He could feel the disturbance in the spiritual ether. It was like a siren screaming in his ear. Joseph slammed on the brakes as the road ahead ended. It didn't end in a barrier. It ended in a crowd. Thousands of people were fleeing the city center. It was a stampede. Joseph stood up in the jeep. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the glowing dome of light in the distance. He felt the vines of hermit purple twitching under his skin. They were terrified. His stand was afraid to come out. That had never happened before. Avdol spoke. His voice was trembling. He said that this was not Dio. He said the energy was different. Dio was cold. Dio was dark. This energy was hot. It was blinding. It felt like judgment. Jotaro pulled his cap down. He said nothing. But Star Platinum had manifested its arm to block an invisible wind. The pressure was hitting them even here, 5 miles out. Polnareff leaned forward. He asked what they were dealing with. He asked if it was a new enemy stand user. Avdol shook his head. He said no single user had this much power. This felt like the sun itself had landed on Earth. Back at the plaza, the military had arrived. The Egyptian army deployed tanks. They were T-55S and older pattern models. They rumbled down the newly formed marble avenues. The tank commanders were confused. Their maps showed narrow streets. They were driving on a parade ground that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. They saw the golden figure on the dais. He was motionless. He stood like a statue. The tanks formed a line. Infantry dismounted. They set up machine gun positions. A general spoke through a megaphone. He demanded the intruder surrender. He warned that they would open fire with heavy ordnance. The emperor opened his eyes. He calculated the trajectory of the tank shells. He calculated the blast radius. He considered the structural integrity of his new plaza. He decided that a demonstration was necessary to prevent further waste of human resources. He did not want to slaughter these soldiers. They were human. They were potential subjects. They simply needed to be educated on the new hierarchy. The emperor raised his left hand. The air above the tanks shimmered. A psychic storm manifested. It was not the chaotic lightning of the warp. It was geometric. Golden fractals spun in the air. The soldiers looked up, mesmerized. The emperor closed his hand. The barrels of the main battle tanks bent upward. It happened simultaneously to 12 tanks. The steel heated and curled like wax candles. The breech mechanisms fused shut. The machine guns jammed as their internal springs turned to dust. The weapons were rendered useless in a single second of focus transmutation. The soldiers panicked. They dropped their useless rifles. They looked at the giant. The emperor spoke again. This time, he projected his voice physically. It boomed across the plaza, amplified by the acoustics of the marble. He spoke in perfect Arabic. He told them to disperse. He told them that their government was suspended. He told them that he was the new authority. He told them to return to their homes and await instructions. The psychological weight of the voice broke their chain of command. The general fell to his knees. He began to pray. The soldiers routed. They fled the plaza, leaving their disabled vehicles behind. The Emperor watched them go. It was a messy victory, but acceptable. He had secured the perimeter. Now he turned his attention to the true threat, the vampire. In the shadowed library of his mansion, Dio Brando stood very still. The world hovered behind him. The golden stand was agitated. It punched the air, testing the resistance. Dio had felt the ripple when his servant Pet Shop died. He had felt the crushing weight of the psychic wave that bent the tank barrels. For the first time in 100 years, Dio felt uncertainty. This was not the Joestars. This was something ancient. Dio walked to his bookshelf. He pulled a book on history. He looked for records of giants. He found nothing that matched this power. Dio's vanity surged. He was the destined ruler of this world. He had transcended humanity. He would not be cowed by a light show. He decided to test this intruder. He would not go himself. He would send his vanguard. He called for Vanilla Ice. The void user appeared from the shadows. He bowed. Dio gave the order. He told Vanilla Ice to go to the plaza. He told him to erase the golden giant. He told him to leave no trace. Vanilla Ice accepted the command with fanatical devotion. He sank into his void dimension. He moved through the city, an invisible ball of destruction. The Emperor stood on his dais. He felt the approach of the void. It was a distinct emptiness moving through the fabric of space. It was a hole in reality. It was dangerous. It reminded him of the vortex of weapons used during the dark age of technology. He prepared himself. The void sphere erupted from the ground at the base of the dais. It consumed a chunk of the granite steps. It circled around, aiming for the Emperor's back. Vanilla Ice, inside his dimension, could not see. He was blind. He relied on the spiral path of destruction. He spiraled inward, aiming to intersect with the golden armor. The Emperor did not dodge. He waited until the void was meters away. He identified the anchor point of the phenomenon. The void was sustained by the biological will of the man inside it. The Emperor focused his psychic might into a spear of pure order. He thrust his mind into the singularity. He found Vanilla Ice's mind in the darkness. He did not speak to him. He simply imposed the concept of existence upon him. The void required negation to exist. The Emperor forced affirmation. The metaphysical clash was instantaneous. The void sphere shattered. Vanilla Ice was ejected from his dimension. He tumbled across the marble floor, his body smoking. He looked up, dazed. He saw the Emperor towering over him. Vanilla Ice screamed. He tried to summon Cream, his stand. The avatar began to manifest. It was a monstrous, skeletal thing. The Emperor looked at the stand. He saw the tether connecting it to Vanilla Ice's soul. The Emperor raised his sword. The blade wreathed in fire. He did not cut the man. He cut the air above the man. He severed the tether. It was a metaphysical surgery. The stand shrieked and dissolved into mist. Vanilla Ice gasped. He felt his soul rip. The power was gone. He was just a man. A vampire, but a man. The Emperor stepped down. He grabbed Vanilla Ice by the throat. The vampire hissed. He tried to claw at the auramite. His nails broke. The Emperor lifted him into the air. He examined the physiology. Undead, parasitic, a mutation of the human form, an abomination. The Emperor's eyes glowed. He channeled the solar energy of his own soul into his hand. It was the power of a star. Vanilla Ice did not have time to beg. The solar energy flooded his cells. He did not burn. He disintegrated. The vampiric curse was burned out of his biology on a subatomic level. In a second, the Emperor held a handful of ash. He opened his hand. The wind blew the ash away. The Emperor looked toward the mansion in the distance. He knew the master was watching. He knew the master was afraid. The emperor projected a thought. It was a spear of telepathy thrown directly at Dio. It carried a single message: submission or extinction. Dio staggered back in his library. The mental voice hit him like a physical blow. He wiped a drop of blood from his eye. His regeneration was slow. The psychic damage was real. Dio grit his teeth. His pride flared. He would not submit. He was Dio. He slammed his fist onto the table, shattering it. He realized he needed allies. He needed the Joestars. The thought was bile in his mouth. But this enemy was an extinction event. If Dio died, his ambitions died. If the Joestars died, he won. But if this golden god won, everything ended. The emperor returned to the center of the dais. He had analyzed the combat data. The stands were psychic projections. They were vulnerable to direct will dominion. They could be severed. This confirmed his hypothesis. The local population was psychically active but untrained. They were dangerous children playing with loaded weapons. He needed to accelerate the compliance. He began the second phase of his arrival. He needed resources. He needed a logistical chain. He looked at the abandoned tanks. He looked at the marble plaza. He needed labor. He expanded his mind again, covering the 4 blocks he had conquered. He touched the minds of the hiding civilians. He did not terrify them this time. He soothed them. He replaced their fear with purpose. He projected an aura of charisma that had united terror during the unification wars. Slowly, people began to emerge from the buildings. They were not zombies. They were not mind-controlled in the crude sense. They were inspired. They saw the emperor and they saw a savior. They saw a father. They wanted to serve. They walked onto the plaza. They knelt, thousands of them. The emperor looked at them. They were his workforce. He began to issue instructions telepathically. He organized them into work gangs. He organized them into militia. He gave them the knowledge of how to repair the tanks, how to mix concrete, how to build fortifications. It was knowledge they did not possess seconds ago. He imprinted the skills directly into their cortexes. The Stardust Crusaders reached the edge of the marble zone. They stopped the jeep. The transition was abrupt. 1 meter was dirty Cairo asphalt. The next was pristine white marble. The air smelled of ozone and incense. Joseph stepped out. He looked at the people working. They were moving with perfect synchronization. They were building a wall. Polnareff shivered. He said it felt like a cult. Kakyuin agreed. He said their eyes were clear, but their actions were robotic. Jotaro looked at the emperor in the distance. The giant was barely visible, a speck of gold light 500 meters away. Jotaro felt star platinum vibrating. The stand was angry. It wanted to fight, but it also wanted to bow. The conflict was making Jotaro nauseous. Avdol stepped forward. He threw some magical fire into the air to test the atmosphere. The fire fizzled out. The physics of this zone were locked down. The Emperor's will suppressed unauthorized psychic activity. Avdol gasped. He said that inside this zone, their stands would be weaker. The enemy controlled the battlefield's reality. Joseph formulated a plan. He said they couldn't fight this thing head-on. They needed to talk. They needed to understand if this was an enemy or a force of nature. If it was hostile to Dio, maybe it was an ally. Joseph stepped onto the marble. Immediately, the Emperor's head turned. He sensed the intrusion. He sensed the bloodline. The Joestar blood was thick with psychic potential. It was potent. The Emperor watched the old man approach. He analyzed the threat level. Low physical threat. High tactical improvisation potential. The Emperor decided to allow the approach. He wanted to assess the local champions. Joseph walked for 10 minutes. The plaza was huge. He felt the eyes of the workers on him. They didn't attack, they just worked. When Joseph reached the foot of the dais, he had to crane his neck. The emperor was 14 feet tall. The size was impossible. Joseph swallowed hard. He used his best diplomatic voice. He asked who the giant was. He asked what he wanted with Earth. The emperor looked down. His face was a mask of golden perfection. His eyes were ancient voids. He spoke. The voice was not loud, but it vibrated in Joseph's chest. He said he was the revelation. He said he was the master of mankind. He said he had come to save humanity from the darkness that was coming. He pointed his sword at the mansion in the distance. He said the mutant Dio was a symptom of a sick world. He said he would cure the sickness. Joseph felt a chill. The words were good, but the tone was absolute. There was no room for negotiation. This was a tyrant. A benevolent tyrant, perhaps, but a tyrant. Joseph asked what would happen after Dio was defeated. The emperor answered. He said that humanity would be united. Borders would be dissolved. False idols would be cast down. Superstition would be eradicated. All would serve the imperial truth. Joseph realized what this meant. It meant the end of freedom. It meant the end of the world as they knew it. It was a different kind of apocalypse. Joseph took a step back. He said they couldn't accept that. He said humanity had the right to make its own mistakes. The emperor's expression did not change. He regarded Joseph with a mix of pity and disappointment. He said that the right to error was the right to extinction. He said he would not permit it. He raised his hand. The conversation was over. He gave Joseph a choice: submit and serve as a lieutenant in the new order, or be removed as an obstacle. Joseph turned and ran. He didn't look back. He ran back to the jeep. He shouted for them to drive. He knew now. This was not an ally. This was a rival conqueror. They were caught between Dio and the god was much, much stronger. As the jeep peeled away, the emperor watched them go. He did not strike them down. They would return. They were warriors. They would try to fight. And when they did, he would break them. And then he would rebuild them. He turned back to his workers. The fortress was rising. The compliance of Cairo had begun. He checked the sky. The stars were different here, but the mission was the same. Order would be established, at any cost. The dawn did not come to Cairo. The sun rose in the east, but it was rendered redundant by the pillar of golden light that now dominated the city center. This light did not behave according to the laws of photon scattering. It was heavy. It possessed mass. Satellite imagery from the Soviet Union and the United States showed a thermal anomaly that defied thermodynamics. The heat signature was contained within a perfect geometric circle of 4 kilometers. Inside that circle, the temperature was a constant, comfortable 20 degrees Celsius. Outside the boundary, the desert air boiled as the displaced entropy was vented into the atmosphere. The global geopolitical order began to fracture within 6 hours of the emperor's arrival. The President of the United States sat in the Situation Room, looking at grainy photos of the marble fortress rising from the slums. The experts told him it was not technology. They told him it was God. The Soviet Premier received reports that their psychic research divisions had collectively gone insane. Every remote viewer who tried to look at Cairo had burned out their retinas. The world held its breath. The Cold War was effectively paused by the sudden appearance of a singularity. Inside the Golden Zone, the Emperor of Mankind worked. He did not sleep. He did not eat. Such things were for mortals. He stood in the center of the plaza, which had now expanded into a complex logistical hub. His mind was split into a dozen parallel processing streams. One stream directed the construction efforts. The local Egyptians, now stripped of their fear and uncertainty, worked with the tireless efficiency of servitors, though they retained their free will. They were simply focused. They built walls. They dug trenches. They laid fiber optic cables that the emperor fabricated from sand using telekinetic transmutation. Another stream of his mind analyzed the atmospheric composition of this earth. It was tainted with pollutants, but viable. A third stream was focused on the enemy. The vampire Dio was a localized cancer. The emperor had analyzed the creature's necrotic signature. It was a biological corruption that utilized a parasitic interface to manipulate the local psychic field. The emperor had seen such things before. On the Ghoul stars, in the Rongdan Zenocides, the entity was not a god. It was a biological weapon gone rogue. But the emperor hesitated to launch a full-scale assault. The reason was tactical conservation. He was cut off from the warp. He had no astronomicon to draw upon. He was the battery that could not recharge. Every joule of energy he expended on transmutation or psychic destruction was a joule he could not easily replace. He had to be efficient. He had to build an army to do the work for him. He needed generals. He turned his attention to the group of warriors he had encountered earlier. The Joestar bloodline. He had tasted their genetic code on the air. It was strong. It was remarkably stable. They possessed a natural affinity for the psychic projection they called stands. In the Imperium, they would have been black ship ties, or perhaps, with proper conditioning, candidates for the Adeptus Astartes. The tall one, Jotaro, possessed a temperament that reminded the Emperor of Rogel Dawn, stoic, unyielding, furious. The Emperor decided that acquisition of these assets was a priority. He would bring them into the Imperial truth. Outside the zone, in a dusty hotel room that smelled of stale tobacco and fear, the Stardust Crusaders plotted their death. Joseph Joestar paced the room. He had a map of Cairo spread out on the table. He had drawn a red circle around the Emperor's territory. It covered the Nile crossings. It cut off the direct route to Dio's mansion. They were trapped between a hammer and an anvil. Avdol was meditating in the corner, but his face was twisted in pain. Magician's red was flickering. The sheer proximity of the Emperor was dampening their stands. It was like trying to light a match in a hurricane. Kakyoin spoke first. He said that the giant had mentioned submission or extinction. He noted the absolute lack of compromise in the giant's voice. Kakyoin was a student of history. He recognized the rhetoric. It was the rhetoric of totalitarians. It was the logic that said individual liberty was a chaotic variable that must be eliminated for the greater good. Kakyoin said they could not ally with this being. If they helped him kill Dio, the Emperor would simply enslave the world afterwards. They had to stop both. Polnareff asked how they were supposed to stop a guy who could turn tanks into pretzels with his mind. It was a valid question. Jotaro sat by the window, staring at the golden light. He said they needed to see if the giant had a range limit. He noted that the power seemed to be concentrated in the plaza. If they could lure him out, or if they could strike at Dio while the Emperor was distracted, they might have a chance. Jotaro suggested a stealth insertion. They would split up. One group would probe the Emperor's defenses to create a distraction. The other would rush Dio's mansion. It was a suicide mission, but they had no other choice. The longer they waited, the stronger the Emperor's fortress became. Meanwhile, in the shadows of his mansion, Dio Brando had come to a similar conclusion. He sat on his velvet throne, his fingernails digging into the armrests. He was immortal. He was the apex of evolution, and yet he was trembling. The golden light outside was anathema to him. It was not sunlight, but it carried the same metaphysical weight. It burned his senses. Dio knew he could not wait. The giant was building a kingdom. Soon, the entire city would be converted into that marble nightmare. Dio needed to break the stalemate. He needed to flood the board with pieces the Emperor could not ignore. Dio summoned the hag Enya. She was old, but her devotion was absolute. Dio gave her a command that disgusted even his own sense of aesthetics. He told her to use the flesh buds. He told her to use the stone mask replicas he had recovered from the ruins of the Joestar estate years ago. He told her to go into the slums of Cairo, into the barracks of the chaotic military units outside the city, and mass-produce soldiers. He did not want quality. He wanted quantity. He wanted a horde. He would create a screen of flesh to absorb the Emperor's fire, while he, Dio, found a way to strike the giant's heart. Enya obeyed. She went into the night. She moved through the terrified populace of the uncontrolled zones. She planted the buds in the brains of beggars, soldiers, and thieves. She forced the stone masks onto their faces. The transformation was gruesome. Men tore at their own faces as their skulls fractured and reformed. Their canine teeth elongated. Their brains were rewired for aggression and hunger. By midnight, Dio had an army of 5,000 ghouls. They were not true vampires. They were mindless, ravenous thralls. They were fodder. The attack began at 0300 hours. The silence of the night was shattered by the collective scream of 5,000 undead throats. The horde poured out of the narrow streets and surged toward the marble boundary of the Golden Zone. They carried rusted weapons, clubs, and their own claws. They were a tide of filth crashing against the shore of order. The Emperor stood on his dais. He felt them coming. He felt the rot. It was a familiar sensation. Nurgle's corruption often started this way. Mindless plagues meant to overwhelm the defenses through sheer attrition. The Emperor did not step down from his throne. He simply adjusted his tactical output. He telepathically linked with his new militia. The Egyptian workers he had uplifted were now standing on the marble walls. They held the rifles they had been given. They did not tremble. The Emperor's will was their spine. Fire. The command was a single thought shared by 2,000 men. The rifles cracked in perfect unison. A wall of lead slammed into the first wave of the undead. Bodies exploded. Limbs were severed. But the ghouls felt no pain. They trampled over their fallen kin and kept coming. They reached the marble walls. They began to climb, digging their claws into the pristine white stone. The Emperor frowned. Projectile weapons were inefficient against necrotic biology. He required a thermal solution. He raised his right hand. He pointed a finger at the center of the horde. He did not unleash a psychic storm this time. He utilized a precise manipulation of the air molecules. He excited the nitrogen and oxygen atoms in a 10-meter corridor. The air ignited. A lance of plasma, hotter than the surface of the sun, streaked from his finger. It swept across the front line of the horde. It was a scythe of fire. The ghouls did not burn. They sublimated. Hundreds of them vanished in a flash of white light. The smell of ozone overpowered the smell of rot. But while the Emperor was purging the filth, the real attack began. From the rooftops, the remaining stand users of Dio's court launched their ambush. Mariah, the user of Bastet, had positioned herself on a high minaret. She did not target the Emperor directly. She targeted the infrastructure. She magnetized the rebar inside the newly formed concrete. She magnetized the tanks. She created a magnetic singularity in the center of the plaza. Metal began to fly. The tanks that the Emperor had disabled were suddenly ripped from the ground. Steel beams tore out of the ground. The weapons in the hands of the militia were yanked from their grip. A vortex of jagged metal swirled around the Emperor, moving at the speed of a cyclone. It was a shrapnel storm meant to shred him to pieces. The Emperor stood within the eye of the storm. The metal shrieked as it bounced off his kind shield. He analyzed the vector of the attack. Magnetism, a fundamental force. The user was manipulating the electromagnetic field. Clever, but crude. He expanded his mind. He grabbed the magnetic field. He did not fight it. He inverted it. Mariah screamed as the magnetic polarity of her own body was suddenly reversed. She was pulled off the minaret. She flew through the air, drawn irresistibly toward the center of the vortex she had created. She slammed into the ball of scrap metal. The impact crushed her instantly. The magnetic field collapsed. The metal rained down onto the plaza with a deafening crash. But the distraction had worked. In the chaos, the Stardust Crusaders had made their move. They had used the noise of the battle to flank the Golden Zone. They were not attacking the Emperor. They were sprinting toward Dio's mansion. They hoped the Emperor would be too busy slaughtering zombies to notice 6 men running through the shadows. They were wrong. The Emperor's awareness was spherical. He saw the Horde. He saw the magnetic user. And he saw the Joestars. He saw them running away from his light. He saw them running toward the darkness. This was an error in judgment. They were running toward their deaths. Dio was too strong for them. The Emperor had calculated the vampire's growth. Dio was currently absorbing the souls of the civilians in his mansion to boost his power. If the Joestars went there now, they would be consumed. The Emperor could not allow potential assets to be wasted. He had to intervene, but he could not leave the dais. The Horde was still pouring in. If he left the locus of his power, the reality stabilization field would collapse, and the ghouls would overrun the city. He needed to stop the Joestars from a distance. He needed to build a wall they could not cross. He focused his will on the street in front of the Crusaders. The ground erupted. A wall of golden psychic fire shot up into the sky. It blocked the path to Dio's mansion. Joseph Joestar skidded to a halt. The heat was intense. It singed his eyebrows. He looked back at the plaza. The giant was looking directly at them. The Emperor's voice boomed in their heads. Do not proceed. The Xenos threat is beyond your capacity. Return to the light. Submit and be saved. Jotaro looked at the wall of fire. Then he looked at the Emperor. He clenched his fists. He hated being told what to do. He hated being protected like a child. He summoned Star Platinum. The purple giant floated beside him. Jotaro yelled that they didn't ask for saving. He ordered Star Platinum to punch a hole in the fire. Star Platinum unleashed a barrage of punches. Aura, 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 aura. The fists moved faster than light. They struck the psychic barrier. Shockwaves rippled through the city. Windows blew out for miles. But the fire did not break. It was solid will. It was the same barrier that held back the demons of the warp. A teenage delinquent's fighting spirit, no matter how potent, could not break the Emperor's prohibition. The Emperor felt the impacts. He was impressed. The boy had power. Raw, unrefined, but massive. He decided to apply more pressure. He needed them to understand the hierarchy. He tightened the cage. The wall of fire began to curve. It encircled the Crusaders. It was trapping them. This was the catastrophe. The Crusaders were now trapped between the Emperor and the horde of ghouls that was flanking around the plaza. The undead had sensed the fresh meat. A splinter group of 500 zombies broke away from the main assault and charged the trapped Crusaders. Avdol saw them coming. He stepped forward. He called upon Magician's Red. He unleashed a crossfire hurricane. The flames incinerated the front row of zombies. But there were too many, and Avdol's fire was weakening. The Emperor's presence was suffocating the connection to their stands. Avdol felt his spiritual energy draining away. He dropped to one knee. Bonarev screamed. He summoned Silver Chariot. The knights sliced through heads and limbs. But the zombies didn't care about dismemberment. They crawled. They bit. Iggy the dog unleashed the fool, creating a sand bunker. They backed into it. They were surrounded. The Emperor's wall of fire behind them, the undead horde in front of them. The Emperor watched. He was testing them. He wanted to see if they would break. He wanted them to ask for help. He wanted them to submit. Ask, he projected. Ask for my protection, and I will grant it. Pledge your loyalty, and the enemy dies. Joseph Joestar looked at his grandson. He looked at his friends. They were bleeding. They were tired. If they did nothing, they would be eaten. If they submitted, they would be slaves. Joseph made a choice. He grabbed a walkie-talkie he had stolen from the Speedwagon Foundation helicopter. He tuned it to a specific frequency. He wasn't calling for help. He was calling for a distraction. He broadcasted a message to the Speedwagon Foundation agents monitoring the perimeter. He told them to blow the dam. The Aswan High Dam was hundreds of miles away, but there were local reservoirs and control sluices for the Nile irrigation in Cairo. Joseph told them to blow the floodgates. It was a desperate, insane plan. The Foundation agents hesitated, but Joseph screamed that it was the only way to wash the zombies away. They detonated the charges. The roar of water was the sound of the second catastrophe. The Nile, already swollen, burst its banks. A massive wave of black water surged through the streets of Cairo. It hit the slums. It hit the Golden Zone. It hit the Crusaders. The water slammed into the undead horde. Zombies are heavy, but they cannot swim against a tsunami. The floodwaters swept them away, churning them into a paste against the buildings. The water hit the Emperor's psychic wall. Steam exploded into the air as the fire met the flood. The barrier shattered. The Crusaders were washed away, tumbling in the chaotic current. The Emperor stood on his dais as the water rushed around it. The marble plaza was elevated, so he was dry. But his concentration was broken. The cure he was performing on the city was interrupted. The infrastructure he had built was damaged. He looked at the chaos. He looked at the destruction caused by the humans' refusal to submit. He felt a cold spike of anger. Not the hot rage of Angron, but the cold judicial fury of a disappointed creator. These humans would destroy their own city, rather than accept his order. They were children breaking their toys. The floodwaters receded after an hour, leaving behind a city coated in mud and slime. The undead army was washed away, but so was the Emperor's progress. The streets were ruined. The Crusaders were gone, washed downstream, alive but scattered. The Emperor decided that the time for subtle integration was over. The velvet glove had failed. He needed the iron gauntlet. He looked at the mud-covered survivors in the plaza. He looked at the sky. He began to draw in more power. He was going to initiate the protocol of unification. He would not just build a fortress. He would overwrite the city. He reached out and seized the mind of every human being within a 10-mile radius. It was a violent intrusion. He did not ask for permission. He seized their motor functions. Thousands of people stopped moving. They stood up in the mud. Their eyes glowed with a faint golden light. "We will rebuild," the Emperor spoke through 10,000 mouths at once, "and there will be no more resistance." In the distance, Dio Brando watched from the roof of his mansion. He was laughing. He had lost his army. He had lost his servants. But he had seen the Emperor bleed energy. He had seen the giant's concentration break. The god was not omnipotent. He could be distracted. He could be drained. And Dio had an idea. A weapon he had not used yet. The arrow. The stand arrow. Dio looked at the arrow in his hand. If the giant was a biological being, he had a soul. If he had a soul, he could be pierced. Dio would not send zombies next time. He would find a way to stab the Emperor with the arrow. He would see if the master of mankind was worthy of a stand, or if the virus would kill him. But first, Dio needed to hunt down the scattered Crusaders. They were separated, they were weak, and they were the only ones who knew the terrain. Dio leapt from the roof into the muddy darkness. The hunt was on. Somewhere in the ruins of a bazaar, Kakyoin woke up. He was coughing up river water. He was alone. His leg was broken. He tried to summon Hierophant Green. A spark of green energy fizzled and died. He was completely drained. He heard footsteps in the mud. He looked up. Standing over him was not Dio. It was a custodian, or rather, what passed for one in this new reality. It was a massive Egyptian man, his body swollen with golden muscle, his eyes burning with the Emperor's light. He held a spear made of transmuted rebar. "Citizen," the voice was the Emperor's. Overlaid on the man's vocal cords, "You are damaged. You are inefficient. You will be repaired." The man reached down. Kakyoin tried to crawl away. "No," Kakyoin gasped, "but I don't want your repair." "Want is irrelevant," the proxy said. "Purpose is all." The hand closed around Kakyoin's ankle. He was dragged into the darkness toward the light. This was the true horror. Not death, but assimilation. The Emperor was not just conquering Cairo. He was turning it into a machine. And Kakyoin was just another cog to be hammered into place. The Crusaders were scattered and powerless. Dio was loose and hunting, and the Emperor had stopped being a diplomat and started being a mechanic of souls. The stakes had shifted from a battle for territory to a battle for free will itself. The silence in the processing center was absolute. Noriaki Kakyoin sat on a slab of cold marble that had been extruded from the earth only hours before. He was conscious. He was lucid. He wished he were not. His leg, which had been shattered during the flood, was whole again. The healing process had not been medical. It had been architectural. The Emperor had knitted the bone back together with a momentary application of biomancy, but he had done so without anesthesia. Pain, according to this new god, was a sensory input that indicated inefficiency. It was to be acknowledged and then discarded. Kakyoin looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the residual electrical charge coursing through his nervous system. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a project. The Emperor stood before him. In the enclosed space of the improvisation logic sanctuary, the giant seemed even larger. The golden armor hummed with the sound of a reactor under load. The Emperor was not looking at Kakyoin. He was looking at Hierophant Green. The stand was fully manifested, floating in the air, its emerald tentacles unspooled like the innards of a clock. Usually, a stand could only be seen by other stand users. The Emperor, however, saw across all spectrums. He held one of Hierophant's tentacles in his armored gauntlet. He was examining it with the detached curiosity of a magos biologies dissecting a tyrannid spore. "Ensati to wais ascendi smlugo," the Emperor spoke. His voice did not echo. It originated directly inside Kakyoin's auditory cortex. He stated that the entity known as a stand was a psychic parasite. He explained that it was a projection of the soul tethered to a specific genetic sequence. In the Imperium, such uncontrolled manifestation would warrant immediate sanction. It was a gateway for the warp. It was dangerous. However, the Emperor noted a distinct lack of warp corruption in the energy signature. The stand was clean. It was a tool, and tools were meant to be optimized. Kakyoin tried to recall his stand. He willed Hierophant to return. The stand did not move. It could not move. The Emperor's psychic grip on the entity was absolute. The master of mankind applied pressure. He did not crush the stand. He poured energy into it. He began to rewrite the spiritual code of the entity. Kakyoin screamed. It felt as if his soul was being put through a centrifuge. The emerald green of the stand began to shift. It turned a deep, burning gold. The fluid nature of the tentacles hardened. They became crystalline. They became fiber-optic cables of pure psychic resonance. The Emperor released the tentacle. He told Kakyoin that the upgrade was complete. Hierophant Green was no longer a combat avatar. It was a logic engine. It was a surveillance node. The Emperor commanded Kakyoin to expand his consciousness. He commanded him to see the city. Kakyoin obeyed. He had no choice. The golden tentacles of his stand shot outwards, passing through the walls of the sanctuary. They did not stop at 50 meters. They did not stop at 100. They extended for miles. Kakyoin's mind was suddenly flooded with data. He saw every street in Cairo. He saw the heat signatures of hiding survivors. He saw the flow of electricity in the power grid. He saw the heartbeat of the city. He had become a living Auspex array. He was the first astropath of the new Cairo. He wept, for he knew that Noriaki Kakyoin, the student, was dead. Only the censor servitor remained. Miles away, in the sewers beneath the flooded industrial district, Jotaro Kujo and Joseph Joestar huddled in the darkness. The water had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of toxic sludge. The smell was unbearable. Rats skidded over their boots. Joseph was trying to use hermit purple on a broken television set they had salvaged from the debris. The screen flickered with static. Joseph cursed. He poured his Hummon into the device, forcing the electrons to align. The image stabilized. It was a broadcast from the BBC. The news anchor was pale. She was reading a report from the United Nations. The screen showed a map of the world. A large red zone covered Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. The reporter stated that all communication with the region had ceased. Satellites passing over the area were being wiped blank. But that was not the catastrophe. The catastrophe was the signal being broadcast out of the zone. Joseph tuned the audio. A voice cut through the static. It was the Emperor. He was broadcasting on every radio frequency, every television channel, every military band on Earth. The message was a loop. It was simple. Planetary governance protocols initiated. Local authorities suspended. Cease hostilities. Prepare for compliance. Joseph slumped against the sewer wall. He said it was happening. He said the giant wasn't just taking the city. He was claiming the planet. Joseph explained the history of the world to his grandson. He talked about the fragile balance of the Cold War. The Americans and the Soviets had thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. They were paranoid. They were terrified. If an alien god appeared in the Middle East and demanded surrender, they wouldn't surrender. They would panic. As if on cue, the ground shook. It was not an earthquake. It was the shock wave of a high-altitude detonation. Jotaro looked up at the sewer grate. A flash of light pierced the darkness. Joseph checked his watch. He said that was too close. He said the superpowers were probing the defenses. They were firing tactical missiles. Jotaro pulled his cap down. He asked if the giant could be killed by a nuke. Joseph shook his head. He said he didn't know. But he knew that if the nuke started flying, the world would burn before the Emperor even got a scratch. They had to stop this. They had to get to Dio. If they killed Dio, maybe the crisis would end and the giant would leave. It was a weak logic, but it was all they had. They needed to move, but they couldn't move on the surface. The Golden Hierophant was watching. They had to stay underground. Above them, in the stratosphere, The strategic chain reaction was entering its critical phase. The United States President had authorized a limited strike on the anomaly in Cairo. 3 Tomahawk cruise missiles had been launched from a destroyer in the Mediterranean. They were flying at Mach speeds, hugging the terrain. They carried conventional warheads, but the message was nuclear. Back off. The Emperor stood on the balcony of his newly raised palace. He did not use his eyes to see the missiles. He felt their machine spirits. He felt the primitive guidance systems seeking his thermal signature. He felt the crude intent of the men who fired them. It was disappointing. Humanity had regressed so far. They possessed the technology to destroy themselves, but not the wisdom to unite. He did not shoot the missiles down. That would be a waste of ammunition. Instead, he reached out with his mind. He interfaced with the electronic guidance chips inside the missiles. He spoke to the machine spirits. He asserted his authority as the Omnisire. The code inside the missiles rewrote itself in a microsecond. The targets were scrubbed. The flight paths were altered. The 3 missiles did not detonate. They pulled up. They flew vertically into the sky until their fuel was exhausted. Then they fell. Inert metal tubes landing harmlessly in the desert sand miles outside the city. The Emperor transmitted a return signal to the destroyer. He did not speak. He sent a data packet containing the blueprints for a fusion reactor. It was a gift. It was a lesson. Build this, the message implied. Stop playing with firecrackers. But the effort cost him. The Emperor stumbled. He gripped the marble railing. The golden light of his aura flickered, controlling the minds of thousands of workers, maintaining the physical structure of the city, rewriting biological codes, and now hacking military-grade encryption simultaneously. It was a drain. He was finite in this realm. He was bleeding power. In the shadows of the ruined cityscape, Dio Brando smelled the blood in the water. He was perched on a gargoyle of a mosque that had been half swallowed by the Emperor's architectural terraforming. Dio held the stand arrow in his hand. He had watched the missiles fail. He had seen the Emperor stumble. Dio smiled. The giant was overworked. He was multitasking himself into exhaustion. This was the weakness. Dio knew he could not fight the Emperor yet. He needed more power. He needed to transcend the limits of his vampire form. He looked at the arrow. It had given him the world. What would it give him if he used it again? Or better, what if he fed it the souls of the strong? Dio needed the Joestars. He needed their blood. It was the only vintage that could empower him enough to challenge a god. He sensed them, down in the sewers. The rats were moving. Dio dissolved into mist. He slipped through the cracks in the pavement. He descended into the dark. Deep in the tunnels, Jean-Pierre Polnareff was lost. He had been separated from the others during the flood. He was wet, miserable, and angry. He was shouting for Avdol. He was shouting for Iggy. The only answer was the echo of his own voice and the dripping of water. He turned a corner and froze. Standing at the end of the tunnel was Avdol. The fortune teller was standing with his back to Polnareff. He was holding a torch. Polnareff sighed with relief. He ran forward. He grabbed Avdol's shoulder. He asked where they were. He asked if he was hurt. Avdol turned around. His face was gone. In its place was a smooth surface of bone. The figure wasn't Avdol. It was a flesh puppet, a decoy. Polnareff recoiled. The creature lunged. Polnareff summoned Silver Chariot. The rapier flashed. The puppet was sliced into ribbons. But as it fell apart, a voice laughed from the shadows. It was Dio. The vampire stepped into the light of the fallen torch. He clapped slowly. He praised Polnareff's reflexes. He said it was a shame such talent was wasted on a human. Dio offered Polnareff a deal. He said the giant above was going to erase free will. He said the Emperor would turn Polnareff into a machine like Kakyoin. Dio promised freedom. He promised eternal life. All Polnareff had to do was surrender his neck. Polnareff spat on the ground. He said he would rather be a machine than a monster. He commanded Silver Chariot to attack. The knight lunged, the rapier aiming for Dio's brain. Dio did not use the world. He didn't need to stop time. He simply moved with vampiric speed. He caught the rapier blade between his thumb and forefinger. He snapped it. Silver Chariot screamed. Polnareff vomited blood as the psychic feedback hit him. Dio backhanded Polnareff. The Frenchman flew into the sewer wall. Bones cracked. Dio walked over to him. He raised a hand to finish the job. He was going to drain Polnareff dry. But before he could strike, the sewer wall exploded. It wasn't Jotaro. It wasn't Joseph. It was a drill. A massive, diamond-tipped industrial drill broke through the masonry. Following it was a tracked unit. It was a small tank, painted with the logo of the Speedwagon Foundation. The hatch popped open. A German scientist yelled at Polnareff to get down. UV lights mounted on the tank flared to life. They were military-grade ultraviolet strobes developed in secret after the incident with the Pillarmen in the 1930s. The tunnel was flooded with artificial sunlight. Dio shrieked. The light burned his skin. He shielded his eyes. He was blinded. He couldn't see to attack. He retreated, hissing, dissolving into mist and fleeing back into the darker pipes. The scientist pulled Polnareff into the tank. The interior was cramped. It was filled with electronics. The driver was Iggy. The dog was wearing a headset. He barked. The scientist explained that the Speedwagon Foundation had arrived. They had submarines in the Nile and stealth units in the city. They had analyzed the situation. They knew they couldn't fight the Emperor with guns. But they had brought something else. They had brought a generator, a massive experimental energy sink. They planned to deploy it in the center of the city to disrupt the Emperor's psychic field. It was a long shot. It was dangerous, but it was better than nuclear war. The tank rumbled through the cellars, carrying Polnareff to the rendezvous point. But the Emperor knew they were there. He felt the UV lights. He felt the generator. He did not stop them. He allowed them to congregate. He needed them to gather. He needed all the variables in one place, so he could solve the equation once and for all. Back in the Golden Zone, the Emperor prepared for the next phase. He had stabilized the geopolitical panic. The superpowers were confused and cowed. Now he had to deal with the local anomaly, the vampire, the Joestars, the Foundation. He decided to accelerate the timetable. He would not wait for them to come to him. He would bring the battlefield to them. He knelt and placed his hands on the marble floor of his plaza. He focused on the geology of Cairo. He focused on the tectonic plate beneath the city. The strategic chain reaction was about to escalate from political to geological. The Emperor began to lift. The city of Cairo groaned. The ground around the Golden Zone sheared. The 4-kilometer circle of marble detached itself from the surrounding bedrock. Slowly, majestically, the Emperor's fortress began to rise into the air. He was creating a floating hive city. He was severing the connection to the earth to isolate the battlefield. In the sewers, the water level dropped instantly as the ground above them lifted away. The Speedwagon tank fell 3 meters as the floor shifted. Jotaro and Joseph, in their tunnel, were thrown to the ground. They looked up through a crack in the ceiling. They saw the sky, but the sky was below the buildings. The Emperor's palace was now a floating island, hovering 500 meters above the ruin of old Cairo. Debris rained down. The message was clear. If you want the Emperor, you must ascend. If you want to save the world, you must climb to the heavens. The strategic situation had changed completely. The Emperor held the high ground, literally. He had separated his domain from the filth of the world. He had created a bottleneck. The Crusaders could no longer sneak in. They had to fly, or they had to be invited. Dio, clinging to the underside of the floating city, laughed. The audacity of it, the sheer arrogance. It was beautiful. Dio began to climb the hanging roots and pipes of the floating city. He would enter from below. He would infiltrate the engine room of this new Olympus. On the ground, amidst the rubble of the separation, the Crusaders regrouped. The Speedwagon tank met up with Jotaro and Joseph. Polnareff stumbled out, battered but alive. They looked up at the floating fortress. It blocked out the sun. Joseph adjusted his mechanical hand. He looked at the UV lights on the tank. He looked at the generator. He said they had one shot. They needed to get that generator up there. They needed to turn it on right in the Emperor's face. It would disrupt his concentration. It would drop the city. In the chaos, they would kill Dio. Jotaro looked at the floating rock. He asked how they were supposed to get a tank up there. Iggy barked. He summoned the fool. The sandstand began to gather the debris. It formed a glider, a crude, massive glider made of scrap metal and sand, powered by the tank's engine. It was ridiculous. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of desperate gambit that worked in their world. "We fly," Jotaro said. But the Emperor was waiting. He stood on the edge of his floating domain. He watched the ants building their wings. He calculated their trajectory. He calculated the wind speed. He did not fire. He wanted them to come. He wanted to look them in the eye when he broke them. He turned to his side. Kakyoin stood there, eyes glowing gold, face devoid of emotion. "They are coming," the Emperor said. "Probability of interception is 100%, Kakyoin replied in a monotone voice. "No," the Emperor corrected. "Probability of conversion is 100%. The Emperor walked back to his throne. He sat down. He placed the burning sword across his knees. The board was set. The pieces were moving. The chain reaction had forced everyone's hand. The final confrontation would not be a skirmish. It would be a siege of heaven. The world watched on their televisions as the city of gold floated above the dust. They saw the silhouette of the glider rising to meet it. They held their breath. They did not know that the true war was not for the city, but for the soul of the species. The Emperor closed his eyes and began to charge the psychic hammer that would end the age of stands forever. The battlefield was now vertical. The Crusaders were launching an aerial assault. Dio was climbing from the depths, and the Emperor sat at the summit, a god waiting for his children to come home so he could ground them for eternity. The ascent of the construct known as the Fool was not a flight in the aerodynamic sense. It was a brute force rejection of gravity powered by the combustion engine of a Speedwagon Foundation tank, and the psychic defiance of a canine soul. The glider, a rough amalgam of sand, scrap iron, and desperation, shuddered as it climbed through the thermal layers of the Cairo atmosphere. The air grew thin. The temperature dropped. Below them, the ruins of the old city were a grid of mud and shadow. Above them, the floating marble fortress of the Emperor shone like a second sun, its golden light casting long, hard shadows across the clouds. Inside the cockpit of the tank, suspended in the center of the sand frame, Joseph Joestar fought the controls. The turbulence was not caused by wind. It was caused by the displacement of reality. The floating city was generating a gravimetric shear. The closer they got, the heavier the air became. It felt as if they were flying into the event horizon of a black hole. Joseph shouted updates to the team, his voice straining against the roar of the engine. He reported that the altimeter had shattered. He reported that the compass was spinning wildly. The magnetic field of the Emperor's domain was overwriting the planet's natural poles. Jotaro Kujo sat in the gunner's seat. He did not look at the instruments. He looked through the viewport at the underside of the floating city. It was not a flat surface of rock. It was a complex industrial underbelly. The Emperor had not just lifted a slab of earth. He had transmuted the bedrock into a labyrinth of machinery. Massive pistons pumped rhythmically, driving the atmospheric processes. Pipes the size of subway tunnels coiled like intestines, glowing with the heat of the magma forge the Emperor had ignited in the city's core. It was a suspended hive, a technological terror hanging in the sky. The Emperor, seated upon his throne on the surface, felt the approach of the intruders. He did not view them as a threat to his person. He viewed them as a biological contaminant entering a sterile environment. He did not rise. He did not raise his sword. He simply adjusted the perimeter defense protocols. He designated the glider as non-compliant matter. A sudden downdraft of psychic pressure slammed into the glider. It was not a gust of wind. It was a localized increase in gravitational constant. The sand wings of the Fool cracked. The tank engine screamed as it was forced to push against 10 times the normal weight of the vehicle. Iggy, the dog stand user, barked a warning. The structure was failing. They were going to stall. Joseph made the first tactical choice of the ascent. He realized that they could not reach the surface. The pressure was too great. The god was pushing them down. If they tried to fly over the lip of the city, they would be crushed flat. Joseph jammed the stick forward. He shouted that they were changing course. They were not going to the throne. They were going to the basement. The glider entered a steep dive, picking up kinetic energy. Joseph aimed for a massive exhaust vent on the underside of the floating plate. The vent was expelling steam and superheated gas. It was a suicide run. The glider shed its wings. The sand dissolved. The tank became a falling brick of steel. At the last second, Iggy manipulated the sand to form a cushion around the hull. They struck the lip of the vent at 200 kilometers per hour. The impact was deafening. The tank tumbled into the darkness of the city's interior. It smashed through a grate of transmuted iron. It bounced off pipes that burned with holy fire. Finally, it skidded to a halt in a cavernous service tunnel, sparks showering the darkness. The tank was a wreck. Smoke filled the cabin. The hatch blew open. Polnareff scrambled out, coughing, his silver hair coated in soot. Jotaro followed, dragging Joseph. Iggy limp-walked out, shaking dust from his fur. They were alive. They were inside. But they were miles beneath the surface, trapped in the mechanical guts of the Emperor's fortress. The environment was hostile. The air was hot and dry, smelling of ozone and incense. The walls were lined with fiber optic cables that pulsed with golden light. These were the neural pathways of the city, carrying the Emperor's commands to the thousands of servitor militia above. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, a perfect geometric cylinder. Joseph checked the UV generator. It was damaged. The lens was cracked. It would still work, but the range was reduced. They had to get closer. They had to get the device to the main power conduit, the central pillar that connected the Emperor's throne to the levitation engine. Joseph pointed down the tunnel. He said the energy signature was strongest that way. They moved out. They did not run. They moved with the caution of soldiers behind enemy lines. But they were not alone. The Emperor's omniscience was dampened by the sheer mass of the machinery around them. But his automated systems were active. From the shadows of the machinery, figures emerged. They were not the shambling zombies of Dio. They were the Emperor's militia, men and women of Cairo who had been processed. They wore armor made of flattened calm bodies, transmuted into flak plate. Their eyes glowed with the same golden light as Kakyoin's. They moved in perfect synchronization. They did not shout. They raised their lust locks, converted assault rifles firing focused light, and opened fire. Jotaro summoned Star Platinum. The stand moved with a speed that defied the heavy gravity. It caught the laser bolts. It punched the air, creating shock waves that knocked the militia back. But Jotaro held back. He did not kill them. He knew these were innocent people. He knew they were victims. He knocked them unconscious. He broke their weapons. Polnareff was less merciful. He saw them as enemy combatants. Silver chariots sliced through the barrels of the guns, and if a limb was in the way, it was severed. Polnareff argued that they couldn't afford to be soft. They were fighting for the fate of the world. Joseph agreed with Polnareff. He said the Emperor was using these people as meat shields. If they hesitated, they died. Jotaro ignored them. He continued to incapacitate, not kill. This was the first friction. The difference in doctrine. The Emperor's doctrine was absolute utility. Dio's doctrine was absolute predation. Jotaro's doctrine was absolute justice. And justice did not execute the brainwashed. They fought their way through the militia, advancing deeper into the city's core. The resistance grew stiffer. The militia began to use heavy weapons, RPGs converted into plasma casters. The Crusaders were pinned down behind a bulkhead. The heat was rising. They were exhausted. Then the attack stopped. The militia ceased fire. They stood up, turned around, and marched away. It was eerie. The silence returned. A voice echoed down the tunnel. It was amplified, metallic, yet familiar. It welcomed them to the sanctum of logic. It requested they proceed to the processing node for evaluation. Polnareff cursed. He knew that voice. It was Kakyoin. They walked into a large chamber. It was a cathedral of machinery. In the center, suspended by cables of gold and emerald energy, was Noriaki Kakyoin. He looked different. His skin was pale, almost translucent. Wires ran into his skull. His eyes were wide open, burning with golden fire. Hierophant green was spread out around the room, its tentacles integrated into the walls. The stand had become the room. Kakyoin looked down at them. He did not smile. He spoke. He said that the Emperor had calculated their arrival. He said that their resistance was mathematically significant, but ultimately futile. He explained that he had seen the truth. The world was chaotic. It was messy. The Emperor offered a binary solution, order or death. Kakyoin had chosen order. Jotaro stepped forward. He called Kakyoin's name. He told him to wake up. He told him to fight it. Kakyoin tilted his head. He said there was nothing to fight. He was at peace. He raised a hand. The tentacles of Hierophant green began to glow. The emerald splash was no longer a shotgun blast of crystals. It was a grid of high-intensity lasers. The attack began. Beams of green light crisscrossed the room. It was a cage of death. Polnareff and Iggy dove for cover. Silver Chariot tried to deflect the beams, but they were continuous. The armor of the stand began to melt. Joseph tried to use Hermit Purple to swing to safety, but a laser sliced the vine. He fell, burning. Jotaro stood his ground. Star Platinum appeared. The stand screamed aura and punched the air, creating a vacuum that disrupted the laser focus. Jotaro walked through the fire. He walked toward his friend. Kakyoin increased the output. The air in the room ionized. He said Jotaro was illogical. He said friendship was a chemical defect. He targeted Jotaro's heart. This was the moment of the small choice. Jotaro closed the distance. He was within range. Star Platinum was faster than Hierophant Green. Jotaro could end this. A single punch to Kakyoin's skull would destroy the brain, sever the connection to the Emperor, and stop the attack. It was the tactical play. It was what the Emperor would have done. It was what Dio would have done. Jotaro pulled his fist back. Star Platinum's knuckles roared with power. Kakyoin did not flinch. He calculated his own death as an acceptable loss for the attrition of the enemy. Jotaro stopped. The fist halted 1 inch from Kakyoin's face. The wind from the punch blew Kakyoin's hair back. Jotaro did not strike. He opened his hand. Star Platinum grabbed the wires connected to Kakyoin's skull. Jotaro had chosen to save, not to kill. He chose to try and perform a surgical extraction of the mind control interface in the middle of a combat zone. It was a mistake. The Emperor, monitoring the node from his throne above, saw the hesitation. He saw the compassion. He despised it. It was weakness. It was the flaw that had allowed Horus to wound him. He would not make that mistake again. He sent a command code to the Kakyoin servitor, Protocol Terminus, self-destruct. Kakyoin screamed. It was not a scream of combat. It was the scream of a soul being deleted. The golden light in his eyes flared white. The wires Star Platinum was holding began to channel a feedback loop of pure psychic voltage. The energy surged into Star Platinum, and by extension, into Jotaro. Jotaro was thrown backward. He crashed into the wall, smoke rising from his uniform. He was paralyzed. The feedback had stunned his stand. Kakyoin began to glow. His body was overloading. He was going to detonate. The explosion would take out the entire sector, killing the Crusaders and collapsing the city's stabilizer engine. But the Emperor had miscalculated one variable: the strength of the bond. Deep inside the burning mind of the servitor, the real Noriaki Kakyoin woke up. The pain of the overload had shattered the Emperor's control for a microsecond. Kakyoin saw Jotaro. He saw his friend down. He saw the trap. Kakyoin realized he was the bomb. He realized he could not stop the detonation, but he could aim it. He looked at the Hierophant. The stand was already dissolving. Kakyoin used his final moment of free will. He did not attack the Crusaders. He did not attack the Emperor. He attacked the clock. There was a massive clock tower mechanism in the center of the chamber, a physical regulator for the city's energy cycles. Kakyoin gathered the dying energy of his soul and fired one final emerald splash. The emeralds were not solid. They were liquid fire. They smashed into the gears of the clock mechanism. They melted the cogs. They fused the escapement. The clock stopped. The regulator jammed. The energy that was meant to explode outward was forced back into the grid. Kakyoin's body disintegrated into dust. His soul burned away by the effort. But he did not kill his friends. He caused a blackout. The lights in the tunnel died. The hum of the machinery faltered. The floating city shuddered. For 10 seconds, the Emperor's control was severed. On the surface, the Emperor felt the jolt. It was like a hammer blow to his psychic concentration. The web of his mind snapped. He stood up from the throne, his hand going to his temple. The levitation faltered. The city dropped 10 meters in free fall before he caught it with a desperate exertion of will. But in that 10 seconds of darkness, the Predator made his move. Dio Brando had been climbing the exterior of the palace. He had reached the parapet. He was waiting for a distraction. He had not expected a total system failure. When the lights died and the Emperor stood up, Dio saw the opening. The golden aura around the giant flickered and vanished. The god was naked to the universe for the first time. Dio vaulted over the wall. He summoned the world. Time did not stop. The Emperor's presence still anchored the temporal flow too strongly for that. But Dio was fast. He sprinted across the marble plaza. He did not aim for the Emperor's throat. He knew the armor was too thick. Dio aimed for the Emperor's connection to the warp. The Emperor turned. He saw the vampire. He raised his sword. The blade reignited, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. The backlash from Kakyoin's sabotage was still clouding his foresight. Dio reached the dais. He did not attack the Emperor. He drove the stand arrow into the marble floor, directly into the psychic conduit the Emperor had been using to channel his power into the city. "I reject your order, JoJo," Dio screamed, confusing the Emperor with his ancestral enemy in his madness. "I reject your reality." The stand arrow was a virus. It forced evolution upon that which it pierced. It pierced the city. It pierced the Emperor's psychic network. The reaction was catastrophic. The golden light of the Emperor mixed with the dark viral energy of the arrow. The marble floor turned black. Veins of pulsating red flesh began to spread from the impact point. The city groaned. It was no longer just a machine. It was becoming a biological organism. The Emperor roared. It was a sound of pure disgust. He swung the sword. A wave of fire swept Dio backward, singing his clothes and burning his skin. But the damage was done. The infection spread instantly. The pristine logic of the Emperor's domain was corrupted. The statues of cherubs began to bleed. The walls began to breathe. The arrow had awakened the latent machine spirit of the city and twisted it into a stand. The city itself developed a stand. The ground beneath the Emperor buckled. A massive, fleshy mouth opened in the marble. The Emperor leapt back, his boots crunching on teeth that were sprouting from the stone. Dio laughed. He stood on the other side of the plaza. He was healing rapidly. The chaotic energy swirling around was feeding him. The Emperor's order was broken. The zone was no longer a sterile vacuum. It was a jungle of warped reality. "You tried to make a clockwork world," Dio shouted. "But life is a cancer. It grows, it mutates. Look at your kingdom now." The Emperor looked around. His fortress was turning into a nightmare of biomechanical horror. He looked at Dio. His eyes narrowed. The disappointment was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of extermination. "You have unleashed the warp," the Emperor said. His voice was calm, which made it terrifying. "You have doomed this planet." The Emperor plunged his sword into the ground. He was not trying to fix the city anymore. He was trying to kill it. He began to pour his soul into the blade, turning it into a beacon of cleansing fire. He would burn the city, the vampire, and the Crusaders to ash. He would scour the site from orbit. Down in the core, the Crusaders recovered from the blast. Jotaro stood up. He looked at the pile of dust that used to be Kakyoin. He picked up Kakyoin's sunglasses, which had miraculously survived. He put them in his pocket. The room around them was changing. The metal walls were growing skin. The pipes were pulsing like veins. The city was screaming. Joseph looked at the monitor. The UV generator was intact, but the situation had changed. They weren't fighting a fortress anymore. They were inside the belly of a beast. "We have to go up," Jotaro said. His voice was low. He was furious. "We have to finish this." "The plan?" Polnareff asked, wiping blood from his face. "There is no plan," Jotaro said. "I'm going to break him. I'm going to break both of them." Jotaro summoned Star Platinum. The stand had changed. It was glowing with a faint green aura, the residue of Kakyoin's final energy. It was a parting gift, a shield against the mind control. "Let's go." It was no longer a political thriller or a siege. It was a body horror survival run. The floating city was a living, malicious entity. Dio was loose and powered by the chaos. The Emperor was in exterminatus mode, willing to destroy the entire Middle East to stop the infection. And the Crusaders were climbing up the throat of the monster to punch God in the face. The small choice of saving Kakyoin had led to the massive outcome. The corruption of the Emperor's work and the escalation of the conflict from conquest to annihilation. The stability of the world was gone. The epilogue of this history would likely be recorded on a tombstone. The sky above Cairo had ceased to be a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. It had become a bruised membrane of violet and black, pulsing with the rhythmic heartbeat of the corrupted floating city. The clouds were no longer vapor, but particulate ash and psychic residue, swirling in a vortex centered on the floating monstrosity. The sun was gone, blocked by the sheer mass of the flesh-metal island, casting the entire Nile Delta into a twilight that smelled of copper and old blood. The barrier between the material universe and the Imperium was thinning. The Emperor of Mankind stood at the epicenter of this wound in reality. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was calculating the exact thermal yield required to cauterize the infection. The marble plaza around him was unrecognizable. The pristine white stone had erupted into a topography of biological horror. Columns of bone spiraled up from the ground, draped in wet, throbbing muscle. The statues of the cherubs screamed with human mouths. The city was alive and it was in pain. The stand arrow, driven into the psychic conduit, had acted as a mutagenic catalyst, fusing the Emperor's orderly psychic architecture with the chaotic potential of the local spirit energy. The result was a demon engine the size of a metropolis. Dio Brando moved through this nightmare with the grace of a parasite in a host. He stood atop a ridge of calcified teeth, looking down at the Emperor. Dio was changing. The ambient chaos energy was feeding his vampiric physiology. His muscles were gorged. Spikes of bone protruded from his shoulders. He felt invincible. He had broken the god's order. He had turned the Emperor's fortress into a jungle where only the strongest could survive. And Dio was the strongest. The Emperor ignored the vampire for the moment. He was focused on the ground beneath his boots. The corruption was trying to consume him. Tendrils of black ichor lashed at his golden greaves. The Emperor simply exerted his will. His aura was a blast furnace. Every tendril that touched him turned to dry ash. He was an island of absolute order in a sea of madness. But the sea was rising. He realized that to save the planet, he would have to destroy the city. And to destroy the city, he would have to release the energy he had been hoarding to maintain his physical form in this universe. It was a zero-sum game. If he struck with full power, he would fade back into the warp. If he did not, the corruption would spread to the Earth's core. Below the surface, the Stardust Crusaders were fighting a war of attrition against the anatomy of the city. The service tunnels were now throats. The walls contracted and expanded, trying to crush them. Esophagus-like sphincters blocked their path, forcing them to cut their way through with stands. Jotaro led the way. Star Platinum was a blur of violence. It tore through the flesh walls with hands that were coated in the ichor of the beast. Jotaro did not speak. He did not slow down. He was driven by a cold, singular rage. He had seen Kakyoin die. He would not let it be for nothing. Joseph Joestar dragged the UV generator behind him. The device was heavy, mounted on a sled made from the tank's hatch. Iki and Polnareff protected the rear. They were beset by antibodies, human-sized cysts that burst open to reveal clawed horrors made of rebar and gristle. Silver Chariot was a whirlwind of steel, slicing the monsters apart. But for every one Polnareff killed, 2 more grew from the walls. They were running out of time. The heat in the tunnel was rising. The city was digesting them. They reached the final bulkhead. It was a massive valve of heart muscle, beating slowly. Beyond it lay the surface. Jotaro looked at the barrier. He looked at his grandfather. Joseph nodded. He primed the generator. He set the capacitors to maximum discharge. He warned them that they would only get one shot. If they missed Dio, the vampire would regenerate. If they hit the Emperor, it might do nothing at all. Jotaro turned back to the valve. Star Platinum wound up its arm. The punch hit the muscle with the force of a wrecking ball. The valve ruptured. Blood and steam exploded outward. The Crusaders stepped through the breach and onto the surface of the nightmare. The transition was jarring. They went from the claustrophobic red darkness of the tunnels to the vast violet twilight of the plaza. The wind howled, carrying the screams of the city. In the center of the carnage, two titans faced each other. The Emperor stood near the dais, his burning sword held low. Dio stood on the high ground, his arms spread wide, laughing at the thunder. The arrival of the Crusaders shifted the tactical algorithm. The Emperor turned his head. He saw the humans. He saw the machine they dragged. He saw the green aura around Jotaro, the lingering soul of the one who had died. The Emperor paused. He analyzed the situation. These humans had survived the lethal environment. They had ascended. They were persistent. They were worthy of one final attempt at compliance. Dio saw them too. He stopped laughing. He hissed. The Joestars were like roaches. They refused to be crushed. Dio decided to end it. He would kill them before the Emperor could make his move. He leapt from the bone ridge, diving toward the Crusaders. "The world!" Dio screamed. Time stopped. The violet sky froze. The swirling debris hung motionless in the air. The Emperor froze, his cape caught in mid-flutter. Dio landed on the soft, fleshy ground. He walked toward Joseph Joestar. He looked at the old man. He looked at the machine. Dio sneered. A UV lamp. That was their plan. Pathetic. Dio raised his hand. He was going to decapitate Joseph. He would destroy the machine. Then he would kill Jotaro. But as Dio's hand moved to strike, he felt a gaze burning into his back. It was impossible. Time was stopped. The universe was paused. Nothing could observe him. Dio turned around slowly. The Emperor's eyes were moving. They were tracking him. Dio screamed in terror. He jumped back. The Emperor was not moving his body, but his mind was active. The psychic might of the Master of Mankind existed outside of linear time. He was a being of the warp, where time was a fluid concept. He could not move physically in the frozen seconds, but he was aware. He was watching. The 5 seconds of stop time ended. Reality snapped back. Dio landed 10 meters away, panting. He pointed a trembling finger at the giant. He shouted that it was impossible. He shouted that he was the ruler of time. The Emperor spoke. His voice was the sound of tectonic plates grinding together. He said that time was a dimension, and like all dimensions, it was subject to the imperial truth. He said Dio was a child playing with a stopwatch. The Emperor raised his sword. The blade erupted with white fire. He did not target Dio. He targeted the entire plaza. He was done with precision. He swung the blade in a wide, horizontal arc. A wave of psychic fire swept across the battlefield. It incinerated the flesh structures. It burned the bone ridges to dust. It rolled toward the Crusaders and Dio alike. Joseph screamed for them to take cover. Jotaro grabbed the generator sled and flipped it, pulling Joseph and Polnareff behind it. The wave of fire hit the sled. The steel glowed red hot. They could feel the heat searing their lungs. Dio could not hide. He summoned the world to block. The stand punched the fire, trying to deflect it. But the fire was not physical. It was spiritual. It burned the world's fists. Dio howled as his own hands blackened and peeled. He was thrown backward, crashing into a pile of writhing rubble. The fire passed. The plaza was scorched black. The biological growth was dead, reduced to a crust of carbon. But the city was still floating. The core was still beating. The Emperor walked toward the Crusaders. He did not run. He did not charge. He walked with the inevitability of death. He stopped 20 meters from their makeshift barricade. He looked down at Jotaro. This was the unavoidable offer. You possess strength, the Emperor said. You possess the will to endure. These are the qualities of a Primarch. These are the qualities of a ruler. Jotaro stood up. He walked out from behind the sled. He dusted the ash from his school uniform. He looked up at the 14-foot giant. He did not blink. I am not a ruler, Jotaro said. I'm a student. The role is irrelevant, the Emperor countered. The duty is absolute. Look around you. This world is fractured. It is ruled by greed, superstition, and chaos. The creature you fight is a symptom of this disorder. If you kill him, another will rise. The cycle will continue until the species extinguishes itself. The Emperor extended a hand. The golden gauntlet was the size of Jotaro's torso. Join me, the Emperor commanded. Pledge your loyalty. Become my war master on this world. I will grant you the power to scour the corruption. We will unite this planet. We will bring order to the chaos. You will save your people. You will save your species. All it costs is your obedience. It was a rational offer. It was the logical choice. The Emperor could save Earth. He could cure diseases. He could end wars. He could stop Dio instantly. All Jotaro had to do was kneel. Joseph listened from behind the sled. He wanted to scream no, but he held his tongue. He knew this was Jotaro's choice. Jotaro pulled his cap down. He stared at the ground for a long moment. Then he looked up. His eyes were hard. You talk about order, Jotaro said. You talk about saving us. But you look at us and you don't see people. You see parts. You see numbers. You kill Kakyoin's mind before you even try to save him. You act like you're a god, but you're just a machine with a crown. Jotaro summoned Star Platinum. The stand floated beside him, battered but defiant. I don't want your order, Jotaro said. And I don't want your future. It pisses me off. The Emperor lowered his hand. His expression did not change. There was no anger, only the cold acceptance of a variable that needed to be removed. Then you have chosen extinction, the Emperor said. The Emperor lunged. He moved faster than the eye could follow. He was going to cut Jotaro in half. Now, old man, Jotaro screamed. Joseph Joestar kicked the generator. He slammed the switch. The capacitors discharged. The UV floodlights flared to life. A cone of blinding, intense ultraviolet radiation blasted out. It was focused directly at the Emperor. The Emperor did not burn. He was not a vampire. The UV light washed over his golden armor harmlessly. He did not even blink. The sword continued its downward arc. It didn't work, Polnareff screamed. But they had not aimed for the Emperor's body. They had aimed for his shadow. The intense light cast a shadow behind the Emperor that stretched for 100 meters. And in that shadow, something was hiding. Dio Brando had been regenerating in the darkness behind the Emperor's cape. He had been waiting for the Emperor to strike Jotaro. He had been planning to backstab the giant. But the light exposed him. It stripped away the darkness. Dio shrieked as the UV radiation hit him at point-blank range. His skin began to smoke. His eyes boiled. He was blinded. In his panic, he lashed out. He did not attack the Crusaders. He attacked the source of the pain. He attacked the Emperor. Dio summoned the world. Blind and burning, the vampire stand unleashed a barrage of punches at the Emperor's back. Muda, 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 muda. The Emperor was mid-swing. He felt the attack. He tried to turn, but the world was strong, and the Emperor was tired. The punches hammered into the back of the auramite armor. The force was cataclysmic. A ceramic plate cracked. The Emperor stumbled forward. His sword swing missed Jotaro by an inch. The blade smashed into the ground, shattering the crust of the plaza. Jotaro saw the opening. The Emperor was off balance. Dio was burning. This was the only second that mattered. Jotaro did not attack Dio. He attacked the sword. Star Platinum lunged forward. It grabbed the blade of the Emperor's burning sword. The hands of the stand sizzled. The pain was absolute, but Star Platinum held on. Jotaro poured every ounce of his fighting spirit into the grip. "Break!" Jotaro roared. Star Platinum punched the flat of the blade. The sword, the legendary weapon of the master of mankind, was not unbreakable in this reality. It was a psychic construct tethered to the Emperor's will, and the Emperor's will was fractured by the surprise attack and the strain of the city. The sword shattered. The psychic backlash was instant. A shockwave of golden light exploded from the broken weapon. It threw Jotaro backward. It threw Dio into the air. It knocked the Emperor to his knees. The destruction of the weapon severed the Emperor's anchor to the physical realm. He began to flicker. His golden armor became translucent. He looked at his hands. He looked at the Crusaders. He looked at the burning vampire. The Emperor realized the truth. He was too heavy for this world. His presence required a stability that this chaotic universe could not provide. By trying to force order, he had broken the foundation. He was the catastrophe. He looked at Jotaro one last time. He did not look with hatred. He looked with a strange, ancient respect. The human had rejected godhood to remain human. It was illogical, but it was human. The Emperor made his final move. He did not try to stay. He did not try to kill them. He decided to leave the board clean. He stood up. His form was dissolving into light. He looked at Dio, who was writhing on the ground, regenerating from the burns. "You are the rot," the Emperor said, "and you will not inherit." The Emperor reached out. He did not use his sword. He used the last of his gathered power. He grabbed the concept of the Stand Arrow's corruption that permeated the city. He grabbed the warp taint, and he pulled. He pulled the corruption into himself. The black veins on the marble, the flesh walls, the chaotic energy. It all rushed toward the Emperor. He acted as a metaphysical vacuum. He absorbed the poison. Dio screamed as the power he had stolen was ripped from his body. The vampire shrank. His muscles withered. He was reduced back to his normal form. The Emperor contained the energy. He glowed with a blinding, terrifying light. He was a bomb of pure psychic force. He looked at the sky. He looked at the hole he had punched in reality when he arrived. "I return to the Golden Throne," the voice echoed in their minds. "The duty continues." The Emperor launched himself upward. He became a streak of golden fire. He punched through the clouds. He punched through the atmosphere. He reached the edge of space. And then he detonated. The explosion was silent in the vacuum, but the flash turned the night into day across the entire hemisphere. The psychic discharge sealed the rift in reality. It cauterized the wound in the universe. The floating city, no longer sustained by the Emperor's will, died. The anti-gravity engine failed. The massive rock began to fall. Jotaro looked at the crumbling plaza. He looked at his grandfather. "Hold on," Joseph screamed. The city fell for 10 seconds. It crashed into the ruins of old Cairo with the force of a meteor, but it did not vaporize. The Emperor's final act had been to cushion the blow, turning the stone into sand at the moment of impact. The impact created a massive cloud of dust that blanketed Egypt. Silence fell over the crater. Minutes passed. In the center of the sand bowl, a hand punched through the surface. It was Jotaro. He dragged himself out. He coughed up dust. He pulled Joseph out. Then Polnareff. Iggy dug himself out. They were alive. They were battered, bleeding, and exhausted, but they were alive. Jotaro looked around. The Golden Palace was gone. The flesh monsters were gone. It was just sand and ruins. But one thing remained. 10 meters away, half buried in the sand, was Dio Brando. The vampire was broken. His legs were crushed. He was crawling. He was trying to get to a shadowy crevice before the sun rose. And the sun was rising. The true sun. The violet clouds were gone. The dawn broke over the horizon. Dio hissed. He looked at Jotaro. It's not over. I am Dio. I will... Jotaro walked over to him. He did not summon Star Platinum. He did not run. He just walked. He stood over the vampire. The sunlight hit Jotaro's back, casting a long shadow over Dio. You lost, Jotaro said. Not because of the giant. Not because of the machine. You lost because you pissed me off. Jotaro stepped aside. The shadow moved. The sunlight hit Dio's face. The vampire screamed. It was a short, dry sound. His skin turned to ash. His flesh crumbled. In seconds, the immortal Dio Brando, the would-be god of the new world, was nothing but a pile of grey dust blowing in the wind. Jotaro took off his cap. He looked at the dust. He looked at the empty sky where the Emperor had been. Yara days, he whispered. He turned to his friends. Joseph was checking the radio. The static was gone. The world was calling. The crisis was over. The god had left and the devil was dead. Humanity was alone again. And that was exactly how they wanted it. Jotaro reached into his pocket. He pulled out Kakyoin's sunglasses. He looked at them for a moment, then put them on. He began the long walk out of the crater. The official report filed by the Speedwagon Foundation was classified under the highest level of global secrecy. It was titled, The Cairo Incident of 1989. To the public, the explanation was a sudden, catastrophic seismic event, coupled with a gas main explosion that had leveled 4 districts of the city. The media consumed the lie because the truth was indigestible. No news anchor could explain a floating city, a golden giant, or a vampire. The world moved on, as it always did, ignoring the scars on reality in favor of a comforting delusion. But the scars were real. In the center of Cairo, where the plaza had crashed, the sand had been fused into a crater of perfect vitrified glass. It was a bowl of smooth golden silica that hummed with a faint, non-radioactive energy. The locals called it the footprint of God. The cleanup operations took 6 months. The Speedwagon Foundation teams, wearing hazmat suits, swept the area for the flesh buds and the remnants of the Emperor's bioalchemy. They found very little. The Emperor's final departure had been thorough. He had scoured the infection with the precision of a surgeon. However, the human cost was tallied in silence. The thousands of civilians the Emperor had processed into his workforce did not return to normal. They were alive and they were healthy, but they were changed. They possessed an uncanny focus. They worked without complaint. They organized themselves into efficient collectives. They rebuilt their neighborhoods in record time, using engineering principles they had never studied. They were the orphans of the Imperium, left behind with a fragment of the Emperor's drive stamped onto their souls. They would never be normal again. They were a quiet, efficient cult of order in a chaotic city. At the Cairo International Airport, the surviving Crusaders stood at the gate. The farewell was subdued. There were no jokes. The adventure had not been a romp. It had been a war. Joseph Joestar leaned heavily on his cane. He looked older. The vibrancy that had defined him was dimmed. He had stared into the face of a being that made the Pillarmen look like children, and he had seen the irrelevance of humanity in the grand scheme of the galaxy. It terrified him. He hugged Polnareff tightly. The Frenchman was bandaged, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, his silver hair cropped short. Polnareff promised to return to France to build a memorial for Avdol and Iggy. He said he was done with fighting. He lied, of course. A warrior who had survived the judgment of the emperor could never truly sheath his sword. Jotaro Kujo stood apart from the group. He wore the sunglasses of his fallen friend. He watched the planes taking off, steel birds defying gravity. He thought about the glider. He thought about the offer. The emperor had offered him the world. He had offered him a purpose that spanned stars. Jotaro had rejected it for the right to be a delinquent, for the right to live a small, messy human life. It was a heavy choice. He felt the weight of it in his pocket, where he kept the cracked lens of the UV generator. They boarded their respective flights. As Jotaro's plane climbed into the atmosphere, he looked out the window. He looked down at the golden crater in the city. From this altitude, it looked like a closing eye. The presence was gone. The overwhelming pressure of the golden throne was lifted. The warp was silent. But Jotaro knew that the universe was larger and darker than he had ever imagined. The Emperor was out there, somewhere in the stars, fighting a war that never ended. And Dio was gone. A nightmare turned to dust. Jotaro pulled his cap down over his eyes. He took a cigarette from his jacket. He didn't light it. He just held it, a small act of rebellion against the order of things. He closed his eyes. He would go back to school. He would become a marine biologist. He would study life in all its chaotic, messy, unorganized glory. He would live. That was his victory. That was his defiance. The history books of the Imperium would never record this campaign. It was an apocryphal error, a timeline that was never meant to be. But in the heart of a Japanese teenager, the memory burned brighter than the Astronomicon. The crusade was over. The long drift of history resumed.